All right, so far we have covered the brief kind of introduction, so some overall issues with evolution. And then last week we talked about how it was theologically dubious at best. And you had to do a lot of theological kind of gymnastics in order to get evolution to work. So today we're going to talk about evolution as a metaphysical impossibility. And to me, this is where I think we talked about how the sciences kind of stack on top of each other, and how natural science depends on metaphysics specifically for its first principles. And so if it violates those first principles, then it's necessarily false. But it also, what metaphysics does is give science a direction that works and in a direction that doesn't work. And so when you have a bad metaphysics, often bad science follows from it. So we're going to do a little bit of both tonight, where we talk about, we're going to look at some of the philosophical arguments for evolution, and we're going to sort of debunk those, but we're also going to give some against, and we're going to use the philosophy of the church, okay? And so we're going to start where we left off last time in Humani Generis, which I mentioned was the sort of the most authoritative statement that the church has made on evolution. And I said that Pope Pius XII left some questions open, but was extremely harsh when it came to especially the philosophy underlying evolution. And so I want to read this quote, and what he's really doing, two things. Well, he's talking about using sound philosophy, but he's also talking about the principles that ultimately will reject evolution, okay? All right, so here's what he said. It's well known how highly the church regards human reason, for it falls to reason to demonstrate with certainty the existence of God, to express properly the law which the Creator has imprinted in the hearts of men. But reason can perform these functions safely and well only when properly trained. That is, when imbued with that sound philosophy, which has long been a patrimony handed down by earlier Christian ages, and which moreover possesses an authority of an even higher order, since the teaching authority of the church, in the light of divine revelation itself, has weighed its fundamental tenets, which have been elaborated and defined little by little by men of great genius. For this philosophy, acknowledged and accepted by the church, safeguards the genuine validity of human knowledge, the unshakable metaphysical principles of sufficient reason. We're going to come back to each one of these. Sufficient reason, causality, and finality, and finally the mind's ability to attain certain and unchangeable truth. If one considers all this well, he will easily see why the church demands that future priests be instructed in philosophy according to the method, doctrine, and principles of the angelic doctor, St. Thomas Aquinas, since, as we all know from the experience of centuries, the method of Aquinas is singularly preeminent both of teaching students and for bringing truth to light. And there is, throughout at least probably the last 200 years in the magisterium, there's this widespread support for scholastic philosophy, specifically from St. Thomas.
Rob.
Yes.
So is he formally canonizing Thomism at that point? Is he making it a faith and morals, or is it just kind of a praise that could be fallible?
I think it's a little bit of both. So I don't think he's saying everything, that St. Thomas is akin to like being somehow inspired in his philosophy, but he is saying that the church has long relied on it and taught it and used it to explain truths of the faith. And right, so it has the church's stamp of approval. And so the natural thing to do for when you're, especially on a human, in the level of human reason, like we have with evolution, the natural thing for the church to do would go to St. Thomas and say, well, what do his principles say about this? And I think that's what he's doing. So he's not, I think it's John Paul II later on says the church has no official philosophy, but then he does the same thing where he goes on and says how important it is to learn Aquinas' philosophy. So I think he's going as far as saying, that it's reliable and should be used and should be taught. But I don't think he's saying it's the only way. It's the only philosophy. I think is where he's stopping. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I might come back to it later because you might address it. You might address my question later, so I'll wait to see.
Okay. Okay. All right. So today we're going to look at those italics. We're going to look at the principles of sufficient reason, causality, and finality, and we're going to apply them to evolution. And so we're going to use the launching, sort of where we left off last time, as our launching spot. Okay. And so let's start with the principle of sufficient reason. So a little disclaimer at the beginning. I'm not going to like overload us in philosophy. What I'm going to try to do is make it as simple as possible. But I am going to sort of give the way St. Thomas uses them, and then we'll apply it to evolution. And so the principle of sufficient reason says everything that is, insofar as it is, has a sufficient reason for its being. Okay, so anything that exists that isn't self-existing has some reason for its being. Okay, that's and that reason has to be sufficient for it, right? So there has to be a proportionality between cause and effect, and so forth. The corollary to that, I've already sort of talked about, is the principle of proportionate causality, and that's that the effect cannot be greater than the cause. And you can already see where Pius XII is already sort of leading us towards one of the main issues with evolution. So to put that in simple terms, right? You can't give what you don't have. All right, that's the principle of proportionate causality. So, yes.
So when you say sufficient reason, are you speaking, and in terms of the four causes, are you saying it has to have sufficient reason, like there has to be almost a good enough final cause? Like, for instance, you wouldn't, just I guess we want to stay with kind of biological examples, you wouldn't have, you wouldn't have two eyes unless you needed them to see properly, or something, like, or you wouldn't have.
Yeah, I think it pertains to all four of the causes. I mean, especially the efficient cause, which is the one that we're going to talk about that evolution kind of ignores.
Okay.
And then in doing that ends up also ignoring the final cause. All right, and so just practically speaking, right, a banana can turn, a battery can turn on a cell phone, a banana can't, right? Like, because a banana doesn't have electricity, right? So a banana no matter how long you give it, is never going to give power to the cell phone, okay? Even with 1,000 other causes mixed in. All right, other sort of principle that we need before we go to the first, along the first step. So, and you guys will sort of remember this because we've talked about it before, about the ladder of being. Okay, in material and living bodies, we find an ascending order of perfection, in which the higher beings have their own perfections as well as those of the lower level of being. In the unity of the higher being, the multiplicity of the lower beings is virtually present. All right, so reality is from sort of the top down, from God, who is pure existence, whose essence it is to exist, and then from there, each with sort of varying levels of perfection, each creature, starting with the angels and then man, and then the higher beasts, and then the lower beasts, and then some kind of plants, and then finally you have inanimate nature. Okay, and so all those things have perfections, but as you go up the ladder of being, they have a higher level of perfection. Okay, so stones aren't alive the way you would say that plants are, right? And plants cannot move and sense the way that animals can. Even if animals have the same vegetative powers, right? So they have the powers that the plants have. And then finally, animals can't abstract and communicate the way humans can, right? And so, which again, just by way of sort of review, when we talk about the soul, right? The soul is the form of a living being, right? And we talk about this being three different kinds of souls: a vegetative soul, which has the power of growth, reproduction, and nutrition; a sensitive soul, which has all the things of the vegetative powers plus ability to move around and perception; and then the intellectual soul, which has vegetative powers, sensitive powers, and then reason. Okay. And so, and this we'll come back to this, why it's important later when we talk about how people will say how the human body came about, and we'll show through this idea of the ladder of being that that the human body couldn't have come about any other way than directly created by God. All right, and so just remember the three types of souls and then that nesting of it, and we'll talk about them when we come back, all right? All right, so evolution and the principle of sufficient reason, okay? So think about what evolution does, right? It says that the lower or the less perfect beings generate or cause higher organisms, right? And we said that the principle of proportionate reason or proportionate causality says that the effect cannot be greater than the cause. And so therefore evolution is impossible. All right, so just a simple argument from a Thomistic metaphysical sense, how the lower beings can't give to the upper beings more perfections than they already have, right? And I'm going to give you an example of this, an argument that does this, and then we'll unpack it, all right? And it also, in a certain sense, always like flips that ladder of being upside down, right? And so if you think about if a plant gives life to an animal or gives existence to an animal, somehow the plant must have higher perfections, and so it flips the ladder of being over, right? And this is why, as you begin to believe in evolution, it'll always lead towards either pantheism or deism or atheism, and always away from Christianity, right? Because God is then not the highest being. All right, so let me get an example, and then this will all start to make sense. All right, so Richard Dawkins, most of you know who he is, one of the so-called new atheists. He's written a book called he's written many books, The God Delusion, where he is an evolutionary biologist who likes to pretend that he is a philosopher. And so he has this, what he calls a sort of an analogy or a metaphor which he calls Mount Improbable. All right. And he says, so what he's trying to talk about is how, I think that the example he uses, I think it is like an eye spot or something, and how you could get from no vision, not being able to see, to being able to see. And so here's how he presents it. He says, in climbing Mount Improbable, I express the point in a parable. One side of the mountain is a sheer cliff, impossible to climb, but on the other side is a gentle slope to the summit. On the summit sits a complex device such as an eye or a bacterial flagellar motor. The absurd notion that such complexity could spontaneously self-assemble is symbolized by leaping from the foot of the cliff to the top in one bound. All right, and so he admits there's a metaphysical principle there, right? From nothing, what do you get? Nothing, right? You can't get being from non-being, okay? And so he's right there, but look at how he tries to get around it. He says, evolution by contrast goes around the back of the mountain and creeps up the gentle slope to the summit. Easy. The principle of climbing the gentle slope as opposed to leaping up the precipice is so simple, one is tempted to marvel that it took so long for a Darwin to arrive on the scene and discover it. By the time he did, nearly 3 centuries had elapsed since Newton's Annibus Mirabilis, although his achievement seems on the face of it harder than Darwin's. All right. What's the problem with what he's proposing then? The slow and gentle step. So remember, let's use the eye for an example, for the vision, okay? All right, so he says, okay, you can't go from no vision to the peak of, let's say, an eagle eye. You can't do that in one jump. So he's saying you can't get from nothing to an eagle eye. But he says if you go gradually, you can. All right. Why doesn't that work?
The metaphysical principle from going from nothing to something still applies whether your leap is, giant or small. Yeah. So he's still going to be jumping up that cliff, because if he goes around the backside, all right, at either it has sight. A thing that has sight is called an eye, or it has no sight. All right, and no matter how slowly you go up, you can never get from no sight to sight. Right. So and this is what evolutionists do often, is they skip that step where they go from no to something, and then they talk about, well, from the eye spot, then more complex eyes came about.
But the question we really want to understand is, well, how from no vision did we get to the eye spots? And that's what they can't answer. Yes.
So on that kind of note, I mean, this ultimately, I think what you're kind of touching on is the like materialist explanation of a lot of our powers would be, okay, that like what is vision really? They would say it's probably just some sort of chemical reaction, and therefore, the idea that, okay, you already have chemical reactions, therefore why can other just chemical reactions happen that just somehow then you have to explain how a vision with somebody with a random single cell that dissenses light is somehow more likely to survive than someone who doesn't. But what, in kind of in a metaphysical standpoint, what is vision? Because obviously the organ of like the eye has something to do with it, but is that just it, or is it more than just like, is it more than just the eye, or just the light hitting a cell or something?
Well, yeah. So vision would be it wouldn't be a necessary metaphysical thing, right? Because it's a physical thing, right? And so it would be the ability to discriminate in different light, different wavelengths of light, I would say. And that's more of I mean, how science would define it, which is perfectly fine. But I don't think you need to get, the question is, okay, well, and again, we'll talk about this when we get to the causes, but how did it get there? Because something had to either give itself vision, like who gave the first creature that had vision, right? If nothing had it, how did it give it? And that's where the issue comes in, right? And that's always the issue ultimately. And that's why the principle of sufficient reason, evolution always comes back to that, and that's the question they can never answer. They can never answer how, if they could go along, somehow trace through the evolutionary chain, at some point they're going to have some kind of organism that can't see and an organism that can. And even if it's only a little bit, that's still like metaphysically an impossible jump, right? Yeah, they can't, because yeah, exactly. And that is where, like, and we'll talk about this next time when we talk about the science, but that's where like guys like Michael Behe, who talk about irreducible complexity, come in, and they're not able to refute that, because they can never say, well, how did it get from there to there? How did it get from no sight to sight? Right. And the reason why they can never say is because it's metaphysically impossible. Right? Nothing can give what it doesn't have. Okay. All right. Does that make sense? And this argument that Dawkins uses, this is a favorite of pretty much all evolutionists, right? I mean, it came from Darwin, really, this thinking that if you can get from one place to another, it's impossible to jump across the chasm. But if you just go slowly and over enough time, then you can somehow miraculously get across the chasm. All right. And that's Chesterton actually makes fun of evolutionists for that in his book, The Everlasting Man, in only kind of the ways he can. All right. So that's the principle of sufficient reason. All right.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
So what, you might address this later, but what would you say to like the people who are just like, well, that's metaphysically impossible, but God just miraculously, jumps them up to the next form, basically theistic evolution is kind of the argument, like, even though naturally it can't happen, that's how God does it.
Yeah. So from where we are right now, like, God can give vision, right? And so we're going to show why theistic evolution is wrong. I mean, I was sort of looking at materialistic evolution there. But yeah, you're right. So and that is sometimes the way that theistic evolution is argued, that essentially every place that, where there's these metaphysical impossibilities, God has to step in. And while that's, that's an explanation, it's also dangerous, because, it's the God in the gaps where, and people don't like doing that, because sometimes those gaps actually can be explained. All right, so a couple more philosophical terms, and then we're gonna get into theistic evolution. All right, and again, hopefully some of these are at least familiar. So the first is what's called substance and accident, okay? And here's what St. Thomas says. He says, take note that some things can exist, though they do not, whereas others do indeed exist. Those which can exist are said to be potentially. Those which already do exist are said to be actually. And this in two ways. There is first the essential or substantial existence of a thing, as for a man to be, and this is to be simply. There is secondly accidental existence, as for a man to be white, and this is to be something or other. Okay, so what is he talking about? Okay, so evolution is ultimately about change, right? And so we're gonna look at the principles of change, and we're gonna talk about what actually changes. Okay, so what is the thing that changes, right? Because you say something A changes to B, you don't say A poofs out of existence and then B pops back in. So what is the principle along that continuum that changes? What's the thing that's not changing, right? So for an example, right? I come in and my hair is all grown out and really long, right? Like now that's a change, but what's the principle of continuity in the change? Me, right? So you would say, okay, that change is an accidental change. It's just an accident that my hair grew and grew long, but I'm still the same substance, still the same person. Okay, and so to exist as a substance is to exist as a definite thing. All right, and so everything that exists is either a substance or an accident. And so some things change without ceasing to be what they are. And so those changes are accidental changes. And then one thing can change into another, and that's called a substantial change, right? So think about when someone dies, right? They turn from a person to a cadaver, right? There's a principle of change there. The matter that informed the person now is the principle of continuity between the two, right? And so think about dog. Like a dog is a substance. Its brown fur is an accident, right? And all the things that are about a dog would be substance, like 4 legs with a tail, long tongue, whatever, whatever you could observe, right? But if it had white fur, it would still be a dog. And so accidents are those things that aren't necessarily essential to the thing being what it is. All right, and so why does that matter, right? Well, because when we're going to see in a second, what does evolution actually posit? So it posits that everything that changes is an accidental change. Okay. All right, and so here's a couple principles, and then we'll unpack them again. Okay, so change is specified by and named from its term. That's what it's called, substantial accidental. That's just the thing that changes. That's all it's saying. In natural and physical change, the generation of one thing is the corruption of the other. Okay, and so when something changes, one thing has to go out, another has to come in and replace it. Okay. All right, so a substantial change always results in a new being, a new substance. Okay, and so what would we call an ape going to a man? What kind of change would that be? That would be a substantial change, right? But what about the ape having white fur on its stomach? That's an accidental change, right? And so we could say that there's no well, I'll come back to that in a second because I'm going to do one more principle and then we'll come back to it. All right, last thing, the principle of hyaluromorphism, which you've probably heard about, is just essentially that everything that exists is composed of matter and form. All right, a form is the outline of the thing, what the thing is, determines what the thing can be, what it can actually do, what it can actually be. And so it's the thing that gives it its definite whatness, sort of like its substance or its essence. And then matter is its sort of individuating principle. Okay, so what is the form of the human person? The human soul, right? and the matter then, so is your soul the same as Ryan's? Why not? So the soul, its form is the same, but what makes you individuals is the matter associated with you, right? And don't think matter in terms of like we use matter, like we think material. It's not just that, right? It's a principle, right? And so you could see why, because angels don't have matter, like each one has a unique form, right? Or else they would be identical, right? So, and then the other important principle is that matter can't exist without a form. Okay, can't exist without a form. So matter always, forms are always drawing matter to themselves. Matter can't just be floating around nebulously without a form. It just simply can't exist. And then forms, though, can exist without matter, right? The human soul exists without matter. Yeah, it's not. So thinking more in terms of, I mean, it includes that, but it's also like think matter in terms of it being a principle rather than just like material things, right? All right, so matter can't exist without a form, but form can exist without matter. So how is a new form brought into being? Can matter bring a new form into existence? That's going to be the question we ask in just a second. Because what is, if we are to sort of accept evolution, we would say that that's exactly what it's positing, right? So evolution posits that through a series of accidental changes, a completely new substance is brought into being. Okay, so however many accidental changes it takes, however many changes in the matter, eventually some new form is brought into being. Is that possible? All right, the answer is no, but let's talk about why. All right, so St. Thomas has a couple of, in his commentary on the sentences, he has a couple of principles that are good for us to sort of unpack. All right, so being and simple non-being are infinitely distant from each other. Okay, so he's saying the distance between existing and not existing is infinite. But to move over an infinite distance belongs to an infinite power such as God alone possesses. Therefore, it belongs to God alone to create. All right, so remember, I think we talked about this last week, that St. Thomas, and it's really important for us to make the distinction between creation and generation, right? We can generate our offspring, right? That's not the same thing as creation. But can two material beings or two creatures, can they make a new creature, a new type of creature with a new form? Where does that come from? Okay, so that evolution says that yes, over time, there would be, again, over time with lots of changes, suddenly this new form would come into existence. All right, and so let's go to the second principle. And thus we must assert that God is the immediate cause of all things that did not begin through generation. Okay, so again, he's making the distinction between generation and creation. And we said creation is ex nihilo, right? From nothing, God can bring something, right? And we have trouble with that because we think nothing is still something, right? Like we think, oh, he made it out of nothing. No, nothing was there and then something was there. All right, such as angels, souls, the substances of the heavens, the matter, the elements, and the first hypostasis in all species. All right, so the first hypostasis in all species just means the first of its kind. Okay, so in the Bible, when it talks about kinds, when God created each animal according to its kind, the first horse was created by God. Okay, necessarily, because if a horse is made of matter and form, God had to make the form. Okay. So St. Thomas says that God had to make the first individuals because they were made out of nothing. Okay. All right, and so now we're going to get to Erin's question, and I think we're gonna call upon some of her friends. Yes. Yeah, so I think hybrids would probably, like a donkey or something, right? Like those would be accidental differences between somehow these, they're probably, which we'll talk about this more when we come back to, remember I said that species is a really vague term, right? That when those two species from a scientific standpoint mate, that they're actually the same, they're of the same kind, right? Of the same nature. They're just, any differences are just accidental differences. And it just happens that whatever they generate actually ends up that it can't generate an offspring. But it wouldn't be a separate, because like begets like, right? So it has to be, and that's a scientific principle too, like this principle of biogenesis, right? And so there's no reason to think that the donkey isn't, or the mule isn't something like the horse, or something like whatever it is that mates, right? Any of the hybrids. All right, so despite, yes.
You would just kind of say that like donkey and the horse have the same form, and a mule is just kind of like also has the same form. It's matter, it's just deformed for some reason.
Yeah, something in it is deformed so that it no longer has the perfection of being able to reproduce.
And I mean, can we see the same thing in like, let's just say like humans who have, like debilitating disease, say like Huntington's or something like that, where they know their offspring is going to, like, it's going to be explained like genetics when we say like the matter like that, or is it something different?
I mean, it's not totally different, right? I mean, it's the same sort of principle, right? Where, someone could have, could not have a certain disease. Why am I drawing a blank on that? So that so it could be recessive, for example, and then it leaves their, when they mate with somebody else, who also has a recessive, it could leave their child infertile or something like that, right? That's not outside the realm of. So it could be similar to that too, but you certainly wouldn't say that, suddenly their child is a different species or something. All right, so there is a group of Dominicans who have put a lot of effort into evolution, and they've even written, a group of them wrote a book called Thomistic Evolution, a Catholic approach to understanding evolution. And there's a couple of arguments that they give for theistic evolution, and this is one of them. I'm going to see if maybe together we can sort of pick out what their mistake is. Okay, one of the things that Aristotle and St. Thomas explained is that a soul is fitted to its body in the same way that a key is fitted to its lock. Thus, a human soul can only inform a body that is able to support those capacities. Biologically, this means that a human soul can only inform a body that has a brain that is complex enough to deal with and process language. From a theological perspective, therefore, biological evolution was 3.5 billion year process directed by God to advance living matter until it was apt to be informed by a human soul. Okay. All right. So what are they saying? Okay, they're saying at a certain point, and we'll say some sort of, we'll just call it some sort of ape, that their body was suited enough that it could be informed by a human soul. Right, and that's how the first man was created. What's wrong with that? Yeah, so it quickly leads to dualism, which is really, really important. So does this body that was made by these two ape parents, even though it maybe has a brain that's complex to deal with and process language, does it have a form? So yes. Yeah, it has a form. What is that form?
What is it actually, or what are they arguing it to be?
Well, so it has a form. What they're saying is that this thing, which has to have a form to exist, then has a human form infused into it. But they're saying it has to first have this disposition, which means it has to first exist. And can matter exist without a form? So what is the thing existing as currently? Let's say right before the human soul is infused into it. It has the form of ape, right? So if then the form is what makes the matter the thing that it is, right? So can you just, a la like how many movies have they made where they've switched like souls inside people, right? If you really switched someone's form with another person, what would happen to them? Well, yeah, it would be a little silly, but technically, like the form, which is the higher principle, would pull the body back with it, right? Because that's the form of that body, right? And so if me and Dominic switched places, like somehow my soul went into his body and like my soul would pull the matter of my body back to it, right? And then I'd look just like me again, right? So you can't switch forms and things without switching the matter, right? Because form is ontologically superior to matter, right? Form is what informs the matter, gives it the shape that it is. So if that thing has the form of an ape, you can't just stick a human soul into it. You can't just come along and go, well, because you get what you were saying, like that's how you end up with dualism, right? So now these two things are separate, right? It's an important, do you guys grasp that? Everyone grasp what I'm saying? Because I'm going to give the Thomistic principle to show that it's not sort of making up. But the idea is that the disposition to receive the form doesn't exist outside of the form. The disposition is there with the form, right? When does the human soul enter the human body? When it's created, right? Yeah, when it's created. That form, I mean, that matter doesn't exist without its form, right? Never does the body exist, not even for a split second. It's a human body. I mean, this is so like integral to what we believe about life beginning at conception, right? But if their argument is true, then you could easily say, okay, well, ensoulment, a human soul gets into it later, right? But that's not possible, right? Because the human body has a human soul in it, all right?
So Rob, would they just say that like if you propose that question, would they just kind of say that a human with the human soul is now in like the uterus of an ape? Or would they just say like they had the ape baby and then God took the form away from the ape, I guess destroyed it, and then put in a new like human form with the human soul?
Yeah, but of course, when you did that, the body would change, right? And see, now you're right, a special creation. So in other words, you do all the gymnastics to get here, and you go right back to special creation, because God infused and this is why the church hasn't definitively said that Adam's body has to come from inorganic matter for sure. But either way, once the human soul is infused to it, it's a human body, right? And it's naturally when you have a formal change, when you have a substantial change, the matter changes, right? The matter is the thing that, otherwise it didn't change, nothing changed, right? So if the soul is just infused in the body, that's not a change, right? Because what's the principle of continuity then? Okay, so just to sort of,
I completely agree with you. I'm so confused how they don't like address that more.
well, so some of it is that they don't. Well, I don't want to say they ignore some of St. Thomas's principles, right? And so this principle from the Summa Contra Gentiles actually refutes everything they just said. So forms are not consequent upon the disposition of matter as their first cause. All right. So go back again. What did they say? Once it was disposed well enough to receive the form, it could receive the form. Well, St. Thomas says forms are not consequent upon the disposition of matter as their first cause. All right. So immediately they've left St. Thomas behind And I don't really know who they're going towards, but that's not St. Thomas, all right? So he says, on the contrary, the reason why matters are disposed in such and such a way is that there might be forms of such and such kinds. Okay, so the disposal happens by the form. Now it is by their forms that things are distinguished into species. Therefore, it is not in the diversity of matter that the first cause of the distinction of things is to be found. Right, and so evolution ultimately comes down to it's matter that somehow drives what the form, right? And St. Thomas says, no, it's the other way around, right? Form is what drives the matter. And yes.
Sorry, you finish what you're saying, and I'll ask my question.
No, go ahead.
Just wondering from that last slide, I mean, is that is their understanding of biology, I mean, is that really sufficient to explain the difference here? They say biologically, basically they say biologically, the only thing that's different between a human and an ape is that the brain is complex enough. I mean, that seems to lead very closely to Darwin's kind of, a difference only by degree. They're just kind of putting the form on top of it.
Yeah, I mean, maybe they're just trying to just make it, simple argument. And I mean, I wouldn't hold them to that, like as if, that's all they're saying. But I do think that in the end, they're making compromises with evolution, so much so that they don't even realize they're abandoning their principles, right? They don't even realize they're abandoning Aquinas, and then going back to, what Pius XII said, that, precisely if you're going to talk about evolution, you got to start with St. Thomas, and let him have the parameters around it, right? So I think that's the issue. I think it's because, we have been fed for 50 or 60 or 70 years that evolution is a fact, and people don't have enough faith or enough trust in the Word of God and the way it is, that they assume, okay, we need to make adjustments to this in order to get it, in order to make it fit, and then eventually, you just make adjustments that don't even make sense, right? So if I were to change probably the parameters of this, and I hadn't really thought about how I would do that, but change it so it wasn't really talking about evolution, I promise every one of them would recognize what I was doing was wrong. They would say St. Thomas wouldn't allow that. So the important point is that, the formal cause of the form precedes the material cause, right? At least not necessarily in time, but in importance, and it's ontologically superior to it. All right, and then just to be clear, St. Thomas also says, and again, this is not necessarily directly related, but it goes to just how hard they're pushing to make evolution fit. St. Thomas says the first formation of the human body could not be by the instrumentality of any created power. It was created, but was immediately from God. All right, that's not what they said. Right, and this is right out of the Summa. A form which is in matter should be the cause of another form that is in matter. Okay, so the form that is in that matter of the ape body must be the cause of another form that is in matter, because composite is made by composites. All right, and so he's saying that when that ape child was created, a composite, it was created as an ape. Now God, though he is absolutely material, can alone by his own power produce matter by creation. Wherefore he can alone produce form in matter without the aid of any preceding material form. Therefore, as no pre-existing body has been formed whereby another body of the same species could be generated, the first human body was of necessity made immediately by God. All right, and so that, again, if you're going to be faithful to St. Thomas, then you can't accept anything like what they said. All right, a few more, and we're going to talk about the four causes, and then we'll talk about a randomness, whether randomness can create. All right, so the four causes, we already talked about matter and form, which are the material and formal cause, and we'll come back to it to sort of tie it up, but I want to talk about the other two. So matter and form are what we would call intrinsic principles of change. So something inside that causes something to change to something else. And then there's two extrinsic causes that cause something to change into something else, okay? So everything that exists has to have an efficient cause. That upon which a thing depends either for its very existence or for the manner in which it exists is called an efficient cause. Nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality except by something that is in a state of actuality. All right, so all it's saying is what made the water hot? Fire or some kind of heat or something underneath it. Or so the heater gave to the water is the efficient cause of the water's heat. Right, the water no matter how long it sat there, no matter how many chemicals you put inside of it, assuming none of them would actually raise the temperature. Something that's not hot or didn't have the potential to create heat will never make it hot. It can never get hot on its own. All right, and so that's what it's saying. Okay, so something hot, something that's in a state of actuality being hot, can make something else hot. So if something is cold and it wants to get hot, it has to come in contact with heat. All right, that's it. That's all he's saying. And so every change has to have an efficient cause. Okay. So whatever is the other thing he says is whatever is moved by another. All right. And remember when he uses the term moved, he just means changed. And so I think if we were to be specific, we would say that not so much that things change, but that things are changed by something else. Okay. And that's the idea of the efficient cause. All right. Then the final cause. So every efficient cause acts for an end. Otherwise, one thing would not follow more than another from the action of the agent unless it were by chance. All right, we'll come back to the part about chance. So one thing doesn't change into another just willy-nilly, right? It changes for a purpose. All right, and that purpose is the final cause. And so this idea that every agent, in this case, an efficient cause acts for an end, doesn't mean they necessarily act consciously or wills an end, but that each substance has a final cause, right? And so it has a purpose. So the final cause of an eye is to see, right? The final cause of a tongue is to speak, and so forth. The final cause of a nose is to smell. And there can be more than one of these causes. And what tends to happen, at least when you have a sort of materialistic or mechanistic view, is it just so happens like, so St. Thomas would say, the final cause of a wing is to fly. A materialist would say, because a thing evolved a wing, it now can fly. Okay, so you see, it doesn't have a telos or a purpose. All right, it's just sort of everything is accidental. All right, so let's see if we can talk about the four causes, and then we'll apply them to evolution. It is clear, therefore, from the things which have been said that there are four causes, namely material, efficient, formal, and final, to be both extrinsic and intrinsic, everything we just said. Matter and form are said to be intrinsic to a thing because they are parts constituent in the thing. Efficient and final cause is said to be extrinsic because they are outside the thing. All right, so think of the four causes as answering the question, why, right? So we could ask the question, why is the sky blue, right? And we could say, okay, the sky is blue because the sun is out, and the sun is what causes the sky's blueness. It's the efficient cause. Without the sun, the sky wouldn't be blue, okay? Because it's the agent through which the effects brought about, right? And then if we said, okay, why is the sky blue? And we're talking about, well, what's the purpose of it? Why is it blue? And we can say, okay, well, because it diffuses light and somehow illumines our environment. And that would be the final cause. That's the sort of the purpose of it. And then we could say, well, it's actually blue because it has a certain structure, a certain chemical composition, various particles that are capable of reflecting different light rays. And we'd say, okay, well, that's the form or the formal cause of it. All right. And then we would say, okay, well, what's the material cause? And we'd say, well, there's a wavelength of visible light, and because the molecules of all the various gases are smaller than the visible light, and so that the light scatters more frequently, the sky is blue. Okay, and that would say, okay, that's what it's made up of. Okay, that's the material cause. All right, and then of course for each one of these things, we could probe a little bit deeper. All right, but you get the idea. All right, so let's look at evolution. All right, so what is the efficient cause of a new species according to evolution? What caused a new species to come into existence? Okay, random variation and selection, right? So what's the problem with random variation? And even natural selection, which isn't really, as we talked about, isn't explanatory. All right, so it doesn't really act for an end, right? Do those two things act for an end? Remember, go back to what I said about the efficient cause, that everything acts for an end, right? Every efficient cause acts for an end. Does that efficient cause act for an end? Does random variation act for a specific end, or does it just act purposelessly? It has no purpose, right? Okay, so we would say, okay, it truly doesn't have an efficient cause. All right, and what do we say at the beginning? We said, well, every material being has to have all four of them, or else it doesn't exist, right? So think about a unicorn, right? What is the formal cause of a unicorn? Or we could say the shape of the thing, right? Like we could imagine that maybe there's this shape of a unicorn, right? And we could even maybe talk about material cause, and we could say, well, it's made out of this thing, this stuff. But when we get to the efficient cause, well, it doesn't exist. So what does its existence depend upon, right? So it has no efficient cause, because it doesn't exist in reality. All right, and because it doesn't have an efficient cause, there's nothing moving it towards its telos or its end or its purpose. It doesn't have a final cause either. All right, and same thing with evolution. Every being tends towards becoming something else. That's evolution, right? What did we say that? We said that through the four causes, the final cause is this built-in thing, we call it a nature, that in which the thing fulfills itself, right? Well, evolution says each thing is created so that it could turn into something else. All right. And so if we put it in the language of causality, each form tends towards becoming another form. Okay. And what did he say earlier? What did St. Thomas say earlier about that each form tends towards becoming another form? What is that called? That's called the formal cause. So it doesn't have a final cause either. Okay. The other part that's really important is that ultimately, what does science depend upon? Right? Like what is a study and what does it depend upon? Well, it studies change, right? Principles of change. And if it can't explain an efficient cause of something, then it can't explain anything about change. Right? So if it can't say that you know, that the efficient cause of ice is cold air, for example, right? And if it can't say, well, why cold air works towards that end, well, then it doesn't have a purpose, right? And so science needs those, right? And this naturally sort of leads us towards what's called teleology. And because everything which acts only by intending something, as Aristotle says in Book 2 of the Metaphysics, there must be some fourth thing, namely that which is intended by that which is doing the work. This is said to be the end. Okay, so teleology doesn't necessarily imply design, but we see it everywhere, right? We already used an example. Like what is a wing for? To fly. What is an ear for? To hear, right? So that's teleology. So things have purposes or ends or final causes or things they are meant to do. Okay. All right. So there's one last sort of section that's worth talking about, and it'll lead us into next time. And that has to do with whether so teleology is not necessarily something that can be proven after the fact, but it's also something that isn't that randomness isn't can't necessarily bring about, right? And so it's only when the world is intelligible that we can talk about things having purposes, right? All right, and so again, what is the sort of underlying assumption that that evolution says, okay, all the order that we see in the world is just it's just a random thing that happened, okay? It's random, and maybe there's this environmental effect, but essentially it just came about randomly. So I want to talk a little bit about randomness, and then see if we can sort of tease this out. All right, so of these three things, is the first one random? I mean, is there any reason to think it's not random? No, right? Is the second one random?
Unknown.
No, right? It's not random because why? Well, because it's a rule. I can predict if I were to do it again, I can predict what it's going to be, right? So it's a rule or a law. So you'd say, okay, laws never come from randomness, right? I can predict that no matter how long you draw that string, it's going to be a 3. Okay, so it's clearly not random, even if it has the same probability of being chosen as all the other, whatever 12-digit numbers between 1 and 27. All right. So we call that a law. Okay. And we say, okay, where there's law, there's no randomness. All right. What are the third one? Probably you think it's random? Could be, right? Nothing, no different than A, right? All right. Suppose I flip these over and they have letters on the other side. All right. And so A, what does A look like? Still pretty random. B, we're still at the law. But C gave us something intelligible, right? And so all I did was take the numbers from 1 to 27 and put them, put letters to them, and where 27 was a space. All right. Now, why can't I say that C is still random? Right? Couldn't it just have happened that way? That it came out like that? Because often, so the argument often is, well, if you give a monkey a keyboard and give him enough time, that he could, just randomly type out Shakespeare. Right? Have you ever heard that? It's absurd, but how do we answer it, right? Because we know, okay, that would never actually happen, right? Why? Why not?
Because the monkey wouldn't actually understand Shakespeare. It would just have been.
Yeah, so that's intelligible to us because it's actually not random, because if it were random, well, you would expect that vowels, for example, right? Vowels are about 20% of the letters, right? But when you use human language, they're used about 40% of the time, all right? Which in here, it's, 5 out of 12, like 42%, so. All right, and so I'd say, okay, hold on a second, vowels should be randomly distributed. Spaces, which again happen way more frequently, should happen way less, like you wouldn't even expect to get a space there, right? So they would happen 1 out of 27 times, right? Whatever that is. And so we could look at the reason why it's intelligible is because intelligence did it, right, behind it, right? And so no matter how long some random process could never come up with Shakespeare, because it's not randomly done. It's intelligible, right? All right. So why does this matter? Because there's this move towards DNA. Okay. And what is DNA? What are genes? They have an intelligibility to them, right? Right. So these proteins code for certain things and don't do other things, right? And there's definitive patterns to them, and they're intelligible, right? And so you would expect that, if the proteins were randomly distributed, that they wouldn't code for certain things consistently, right? You expect, okay, well, why does this protein, that's coded this way, why does this occur, way more than this other protein that occurs, right? If they were supposed to be random, why do they occur like that, right? And so just like my sort of letters, right, you can look at the the proteins from genes or from DNA. You can say, okay, well, that's intelligible, right? We just map the whole genome sequence. Why would we do that if it wasn't intelligible? And so we can't randomly get genes that do certain things because the proportions of the base pairs don't match, right? What we would expect. Right? And so we can just look at that and go, okay, that's not random. There's no way that was ever random. And there's always going to be the non-being to the being. So we have genes. Well, where did the first gene come from? Right? Because we don't find any coding like that in non-living things. Right? And so we're always at the point where evolution always has the problem of going from nothing to something, right? Even if it explains how one thing became another, we're never going to get to how nothing became something. Okay. All right, questions?
Yeah, so I guess I think a common, I know why this is